Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to Breast Cancer Action's webinar, Priced Out, the High Cost of Cancer Drugs. And thank you again for joining us today. My name is Kate Fisher and I'm the campaigns coordinator here at Breast Cancer Action who's going to be facilitating today's webinar. We are so excited to have Dr. Vinay Prasad, an MD, MPH, oncologist, and hematologist with the Oregon Health and Sciences University, who's going to be joining us later today. First, a little bit of housekeeping. Breast Cancer Action doesn't take money from any corporation that profits from or contributes to the breast cancer epidemic, and our work is largely supported by individual donors like you. So if you find today's webinar helpful, informational, or useful in any way, we hope that you'll please consider making a $25 donation to support this kind of work. At any time during the webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the question bar on your right-hand side, and we'll save time at the end to answer as many questions as we can. Everyone except for the presenters will be muted during the webinar, and this is to cut down on background noise so we can all hear well. Again, this means that you won't be able to ask questions via phone, so just remember that you can use that chat box on the right-hand side at any time to ask a question. And finally, we want you to get involved with Breast Cancer Action. This webinar is a great way to do that, and please stay tuned for other ways we'll mention later on in the webinar. So, here you can see our agenda for today. I personally am so excited to have Dr. Prasad on to talk about what goes into the cost of cancer drugs. You can see the full agenda, and like I mentioned before, you can feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar by writing into the chat box on the bottom right corner of your screen. To start, I'm going to give a brief overview of Breast Cancer Action. I know that for some of you, you are already familiar with the organization and this information will be old news to you. But some of you maybe came to us through different means and are not as familiar with what we do and who we are. So Breast Cancer Action was founded in 1990 by a group of women living with breast cancer who were frustrated with the lack of information about breast cancer and saw a need for greater community. They founded Breast Cancer Action because they wanted a grassroots organization with a unique understanding of the political, economic, and social context of breast cancer. Our founders, only one of whom is still alive today, knew that their private medical crises were part of a larger public health emergency, and that the experience of those dealing with breast cancer needed to be heard and centered to address this crisis. Breast Cancer Action is the only organization that addresses the breast cancer epidemic from the intersection of breast cancer, the environment, social justice, and feminism. Our mission is to achieve health justice for all women at risk of and living with breast cancer. Because we're located at this really interesting intersection of all of these issues, we have some really important core guiding values that I'd like to take a minute to talk about briefly. We believe that health justice is a human right. We believe in honesty, fearlessness, and truth-telling, much like Dr. Prasad, and honoring women's diverse voices and lived experiences. And we believe in transparency and accountability for ourselves and others. We also believe in collective action that changes the world for the better. And finally, we have integrity and freedom from conflict of interest. We recognize here at Breast Cancer Action how issues of health and social justice are intertwined through the work we do, and from a foundation of our core values that I just went through around ending the breast cancer epidemic. That's why we make a clear commitment to social justice, a foundation of all of our work. So really quickly, I'd like to talk about what that means to us. The first is that we know that breast cancer is an epidemic that impacts communities unequally and leads to unacceptable differences in who develops breast cancer and who gets high quality and timely treatment and who dies from breast cancer. We also know that in order to address and end the breast cancer epidemic, we must tackle the root causes of these health inequities, which are often the result of a complex interplay of culture, power, economics, racism, and sexism. We believe that no single injustice can be effectively addressed in isolation, and we recognize that injustices in our society reinforce each other in many ways and at many levels. And last but not least, in our work for health justice, we strive to be an ally by using the power and privilege we hold as an organization to build solidarity with communities who currently or traditionally have had less access to power, information, and resources. So that's a lot about the values underlying what we do, and I want to talk about some of the specific issues that we work on. As the watchdog for the breast cancer movement, we educate, organize, and take action for systemic change in 3 distinct areas. The first is our work on breast cancer screening, diagnosis, and treatment, which examines the data from a patient perspective and includes breast cancer screening, healthcare access, drug and device approval, something we'll be talking about today, and demands for more effective, less costly, and less toxic treatments. The next is our work around the root causes of the breast cancer epidemic, which focuses on eliminating the involuntary exposures to hazardous and toxic chemicals present in all of our daily lives that put us at increased risk of breast cancer. And the last is pink ribbon marketing and culture, which often exploits a disease that devastates communities, misrepresents who is affected by breast cancer, and excludes and marginalizes women's diverse lived experiences of the disease. We address the true impact that breast cancer has on women's lives and their communities. So that's all about who Breast Cancer Action is, and I thank you for listening to that brief introduction. And now I'm very happy to introduce our featured speaker for today, Dr. Vinay Prasad. Like I mentioned, he is a hematologist-oncologist with the Oregon Health and Sciences University up in Oregon. He is a nationally renowned expert on health policy and drug pricing, and he's also very well known for his firebrand truth-telling persona, both on and offline. So I am very excited to have him with us, and with that, I am going to hand it over to him.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope this talk will be enjoyed by the audience, and hope it's informative. So let's see if I have control here. So this is about cost and value of cancer drugs, and is somewhat of a primer on the topic. I don't think I can click, can I? Having trouble advancing the slide. Let's see, next. Maybe that'll do. Okay, so in terms of financial disclosure, my only personal financial disclosure is I'm the author of this book for which I receive royalties. So, and if anyone can't hear me, please send a little message that it's not loud enough. But I want to talk a little bit about cancer drug pricing. I think many of us are aware of the fact that the cost of cancer drugs has soared every year. These are 2 figures that show the launch price of cancer drugs over time. And as late as the 1970s, cancer drugs routinely cost a few $100s per month. But by 2010, they were routinely $9,000 a month. Now we probably crossed the $10,000 per month threshold of cancer drug prices. The first cancer drug that actually ever broke $1 billion in sales was paclitaxel in around 1999. So I think it's clear that cancer drug prices have grown at a rate not commensurate with anything else in the economy, perhaps except for college tuition inflation. Certainly much faster than average per capita spending power. Oh, there we go. As late as the 1990s, if you made $1 billion per year from sales of a cancer drug, that was very unusual, and paclitaxel was the first drug to crack that barrier and become a blockbuster. But what we see now in the last few years is that many cancer drugs are blockbuster medications. These are global sales of the top-selling drugs in 2013. Rituximab was $7.8 billion in sales. Avastin, a very marginal drug that doesn't work in many cancers, and where it does work often improves progression-free or overall survival by just 1 month, that has annual sales of about $7 billion. Imatinib, a drug that once was thought to be not lucrative to pursue, that would never make $100 million, makes $4.6 billion a year, and the list goes on and on. I think what's notable here is that even cancer drugs that can only be given to very small populations, very focused populations, these have now become blockbuster drugs because the price of the drugs has risen so much faster than what many would have predicted. The cancer drug market does not follow conventional rules of drug markets. It's almost a mistake to even call it a market. It's certainly not a free market. And one of the things that it doesn't follow is the laws of competition. So in everything else in life, when you have competition in this space, the price of goods will fall as people compete over price. But we have not seen that with cancer drugs. Consider the case of imatinib, a drug used to treat CML. A very effective drug. The drug was launched in the early 2000s, and this is the price of the drug per day over time. It's risen steadily since 2004 all the way to 2014, and this has happened while competitor drugs have been approved. Nilotinib was approved here, dasatinib was approved here. We now have bosutinib, omacitaxine, ponatinib. More and more competitor medications are approved, and the price of all of these drugs has gone up hand in hand together. And nilotinib and dasatinib are actually approved in the front line. They have an identical approval. They could easily compete for market share, but they're certainly not competing on price because the price of all of these drugs is rising hand in hand together. So competition does not appear to lower prices with cancer drugs. And I think that's a fundamental problem and reflects the fact that this is not a market. In the last few years, we've heard a lot about some of the abuses of drug pricing. We've heard about Martin Shkreli, about Mylan Pharmaceuticals and their pricing of the EpiPen. And this led Sham Mylan-Cody and I to take a closer look at price changes over the last few years of drugs that have been around for quite a while. So in the figure you see here, this is every medication that was paid for by Medicare Part B in 2010 and 2015. So these are all the drugs that were covered in 2010, so they were approved at least before 2010, and they were also still covered in 2015. And what we've plotted is, what is the percent change in the price of those drugs between those 5 years? And there are a bunch of drugs here that have gone dramatic reductions in price. So what happened on this end of the curve? Well, there were multiple generic manufacturers that entered the drug space, and this drug's price has fallen precipitously. But we've also had a lot of drugs that have soared in price. These are the drugs that would make the news, drugs with 1,000% price increase. And our question was, these drugs, are these newer branded medications, or are these older drugs? Are these Martin Shkreli type drugs? And what we found was actually the year of FDA approval was inversely related to the price change of the drug. In other words, it was the older drugs that have been jacked up most in price over the last 5 years, and not the newer drugs, which have had still price increases, but modest price increases. So what I think this suggests is that people treat these cases like they're one-off. We treat Valiant like it's a one-off, Mylan like it's one-off, Martin Shkreli like he's one-off, but they are not one-off cases. This is part of a broader pattern where older medications have significant price increases. And these are price increases that I think even right-leaning economists do not feel are justified. There is no expenditures on R&D by many of these companies. This is purely price gouging. And the fact that this is allowed to happen reflects nothing more than regulatory failures throughout the regulatory system, particularly in the way we reimburse for medications and in the generic market space. You know, there's lots of debate about where drug prices go, how much go to marketing, how much go to R&D, and the question is there room to lower the price of drugs? So, we can debate this, for quite a long period of time, and unfortunately I have in many forums, but I think it's important to look at the bottom line. The bottom line is that these pharmaceutical companies consistently report double-digit profit margins of 10 to, in this data set, even 43% in one quarter by one pharmaceutical company. These are profit margins that are unique to the pharmaceutical industry and perhaps rivaled only by oil and natural gas. And these are the margins that occur after R&D is paid for, after marketing is paid for, after sizable salaries are paid for. This is the profit at the end of the day. So I guess I would say a few things. One, being a large pharmaceutical company does not appear to me to be that risky, because it's not a risky business if you consistently have a double-digit profit margin. And two, there is plenty of room in profit margins to lower the price of medication without impinging upon drug innovation and drug discovery. So I think it's a false narrative to believe we can't do anything about drug prices because that will impinge on new drugs. Where do the prices of these drugs come from in the cancer space? This is a question that many people have asked, and a few years ago, Sham at Memorial Sloan Kettering and I thought to look at this systematically. So we looked at drugs that were consecutively approved over a 5-year period, and if I recall correctly, there are 40 or 50 such drug approvals, 50 drug approvals, and we wanted to ask, is there a difference in the price of these drugs based on several characteristics that you might think would affect the price of drugs? So one question is, are the newer drugs, the ones that operate via a novel mechanism of action, are they more pricey than the next-in-class drugs, the ones that operate via a tried-and-true mechanism? And one might expect that novel drugs, because they're novel by mechanism, they're harder to develop, there's more of a risk involved, there's more failure, and thus the price would be higher. And next-in-class drugs, these are tried-and-true drugs. You know that a drug like this works well. It's not unreasonable to think a brother or sister drug would work in that same space. You would think that they accordingly would be easier to develop and priced less. So the first thing we found is actually there was no difference in price if you're novel versus if you're next in class. That appeared to have nothing to do with the price of these drugs. And these drugs were routinely $100,000 per year of treatment, as you can see here. The next question we asked was, is the US FDA somehow burdensome and making drugs cost more? Or is the benefit that drugs provide, is that somehow commensurate with the price? So here we've looked at all those same drugs and we've divided them into 3 categories. Some of these drugs are approved based on response rate, which means that they are able to shrink tumors on radiographic scans for the most part, or shrink tumors when measured by blood tests. Some of them are approved based on progression-free survival, which means it delays the time until progression, which is an arbitrary increase in tumor size. And some drugs are approved based on improvements in overall survival. So if you think that it's harder to show overall survival, or that showing overall survival is more important, and clearly it's most important for patients, one would hypothesize that these drugs were priced the most. But what we found was that that wasn't the case. These drugs cost about $109,000 per year of treatment. The PFS drugs cost about $108,000 per year of treatment. And the response rate drugs, those that merely shrink tumors, they cost the most at $160,000 per year of treatment. So this actually doesn't make much sense. The drugs that are the easiest to get FDA approval are actually the ones priced the highest. Trying to get to the next slide. And here we further explore the relationship between the efficacy of drugs and their price. So what we plotted here is for every drug that was approved on the basis of progression-free survival or overall survival, how much does the drug improve survival? Is it a piddly 10% improvement in survival, a very, modest but real improvement? Or is it the kind of drug that we really want, a 70% improvement in survival, a 250% improvement in progression-free survival? I mean, I think we'll all agree we prefer drugs to be on this side of the scale. We want better drugs. So do we pay more for better drugs? Do drug companies price those drugs higher? And what we find here is that the line is pretty flat. There's a little bit of a slope here, but the R squared is very low. So, to translate this, what does this mean? This means that you get $79,000 for a drug that doesn't do anything for progression-free survival. And for every percent you improve progression-free survival more than nothing, you get about $200. In other words, there's very little incentive to, additional incentive to improve PFS. And for overall survival, you get about $1,000 per every percent you improve it, but you get $80,000 for just being approved at all. And the R squareds are actually low, suggesting that most of the price is actually not explained by the benefit. So if you put these things together, the regulatory pathway of approval doesn't explain the drug price. The novelty of the drug doesn't explain the drug price. And the benefit of the drug explains almost nothing about the drug price. You come to the conclusion of, well, what does explain the cost of drugs? And the cost of drugs is actually explained only by what the market will bear, what the last drug was priced at, and the new drug is priced just a little bit higher. That seems to be the only narrative that explains the data in the cancer drug market. So it's not explained by novelty. Novelty here we're using as a surrogate of R&D, but we'll talk a little bit more about R&D. It's not explained by the regulatory endpoint, and it's not explained by how much we improve the endpoint. Now let's take a minute and let's talk about value. The value of a medication is a balancing act between the benefits that it provides for patients, the cost, and the toxicities, the downside of the medication. As they say, all medications have side effects. Only some of them have benefits, and only some of those have benefits that outweigh side effects. The only thing that's for certain is the side effects, unfortunately. So let's take a drug that is an exceptional drug, Gleevec. I would argue that it is perhaps the single best drug made in the last 35 years. This is what we should aspire to with drugs, and let me show you why in this figure. These are men and women who have CML, chronic myelogenous leukemia, in different years in I believe, a Swedish population. And Gleevec was approved in about 1999 or 2000. And this is their life expectancy. If you are a 55-year-old man without CML is the blue line, a 55-year-old woman without CML. And here's the life expectancy if you have CML in 1974 and you're 55. This is a gap. These are how many years of life that you're being robbed of, deprived of because you have CML. And over time, this gap shrinks. And it starts to shrink really rapidly with the approval of imatinib and the approval of other drugs in this space. And now the gap is just a couple of years. We've almost completely closed the gap. So what does this tell you? This tells you that this is a very good drug. It's a drug that is highly effective, that's been able to close the gap, that we almost have normal life expectancy. CML has almost become a chronic disease. We're not quite there yet, but we're very, very close. And Gleevec, is priced at a certain price. So this is the most benefit you can get, I think, from a cancer drug. So let's take a look at the value of Gleevec. Because they've jacked up the price of Gleevec, in 2016, based on the current price of Gleevec, the dollar per quality adjusted life year of Gleevec is about $72,000. Now, this probably falls at the cusp of what a society like the United Kingdom thinks it's worth to pay for a dollar per life year. This is sort of at that cusp. But in the United States, I think a lot of people say that, we should be willing to spend about $100,000 or even $150,000 to add a year of life. Now, you might wonder, why shouldn't we just spend, $1 million to add a year of life? Why is there no limit here? The reason there's no limit is that every time you pay for a drug or something that adds a year of life for $1 million, what you're really giving up is many, many other things that could add a year of life for $50,000. So the reality is you could have added way more years of life to a group of people by doing the other things instead. So it's really about trade-offs. There's only so much money we have to spend on healthcare. Wouldn't you want to spend it in a way that saves the most lives? So that's the thinking behind why there's a cutoff at all. But here I think CML is a great drug. Imatinib is a great drug. I use it all the time. This is the dollar per quality of the best drug we have. So the reason I say this is to put the dollar per quality of the other drugs in perspective. The average cancer drug is not Gleevec. It is a marginal, it is a mediocre, it is a drug that is not good enough for patients. It may be a step forward, but at best it's a baby step, and this is evidence of that. Tito Fojo and colleagues looked at 71 drugs that were consecutively approved for solid cancers. This is how much they improve progression-free survival and overall survival. Some of them improve it, less than a month, some just over 2 months, some 6 months. Maybe one great drug is 10 months up here, 10 months here. But the average, the median here is 2.3 months. The median here is 2.1 month. I think we have to do better than 2.1 months. I don't want to say that 2.1 months is important. It matters. It's better than nothing. But patients don't want 2.1 months. They want 2.1 years. They want 5 years, 7 years. They want what we did with imatinib and Gleevec. We have set the sights too low. Any one of these drugs can make easily $1 billion. Do you need so much incentive to develop another marginal Me Too drug? I think that's one of the major problems with the cancer drug space. Shouldn't we incentivize people to pursue these kinds of benefits and not incentivize them to pursue these kinds of benefits down here? And the result of that, the result of the high and soaring cost of cancer drugs and the low, often less than we deserve benefit of the drugs, is that the value proposition has become increasingly untenable. Pertuzumab, a good drug. I think it's a good, solid drug. But because it's priced so high, it costs $775,000 per year of life added. And it might be reasonable for some societies to pay that, but what that means is you're giving up lots and lots of drugs that could help lots and lots more people. Regorafenib, which I think is a very mediocre drug, it's $900,000 per quality. This is used in colon cancer. Aflibercept is actually infinite dollars per quality because it has no benefit over other drugs and costs more. No society can afford paying for aflibercept. We can't pay infinite dollars for no benefit. We can't pay extra money for no benefit, which results in infinity per quality. And yet, the way I portray the data is different than what you might have read. This is the Tufts group, which has done a lot of work in this space and receives some of their funding from pharmaceutical sources. They have looked at drugs in the blood-based cancers, and they show that actually most of them, some of them are cost savings, some are actually $20,000 per year of life added, some are $40,000, some are less than $60,000, and very few are these kind of drugs that I pointed out. So they say that actually most of what we do is good. But note here that most of the studies they're looking at are industry-funded studies, and they are sort of cherry-picking studies. They're picking studies that are published and available to them. And we've written a rebuttal in Blood where we detail many things wrong with this, but I'll just show you one thing that's clearly wrong with this. This is where Gleevec falls. Gleevec is the best drug we've had approved in the last 30 years. It's $70-some thousand per quality. All of these other drugs, they say, are better than Gleevec. They're better value proposition than Gleevec. I think that is very hard to believe. I think one has to wonder if that could be true. It is probably impossible that any indefinite therapy in cancer medicine has a better dollar per quality than $72,000 because nothing is better than imatinib. And I would say it is probably impossible that anything has a better dollar per quality for a fixed course of therapy than rituximab, because rituximab is $130,000 over a 3-year horizon and $62,000 with a 5-year horizon. Some of these values are frankly too good to be true. Our drugs, unfortunately, aren't that good, and the price is much higher. And so there's a number of reasons why they have produced an analysis too good to be true, which we've detailed in the paper, but I won't bore you with because they're very technical. Okay. I hate to say it, but I think the situation may even be worse than the sort of grim way I portrayed it. I think our drugs may even be worse than what we think they are. And here's why. We do not do an adequate job of making sure that patients who are enrolled on clinical trials that lead to drug approval look like patients in America. They don't look anything like each other. The patients we have on study are much younger, for instance. That's what this figure shows. These are the percent of Americans with cancer who are over the age of 65, it's 60%. Over the age of 70, it's over 40%. And over the age of 75, it's 30%. Americans with cancer are older Americans. Cancer is a disease of older people. And these shorter bar graphs show you how many patients in regulatory trials are over the age of 65, how many are over 70, how many are over 75, and it's much less. We are enriching clinical trials with patients that are younger than the average American, that have fewer comorbidities than the average American, that don't look like the average American. So does the data that come out of these trials apply to the average American? I think that's a real question, a discussion that we ought to be having. And I think there are lots of reasons to doubt that they apply to the average American. So here's proof that they don't apply to the average American. Let's just take one example, liver cancer. Prior to 2008, we didn't have great options for liver cancer. There weren't effective treatments. We used doxorubicin, which is a toxic drug that had a very marginal benefit. In 2008, we had a new drug on the block, sorafenib. It improved survival against placebo in this randomized trial called the SHARP study, and improved survival from about 8 months to 11 months. I think I would call this a modest improvement. It's certainly a step forward, but it's by no means is this a home run. I mean, I obviously still want better for my patients. I'm not satisfied with this improvement by any stretch of the imagination, but I understand why people would be enthusiastic because it's a step forward. It's better than nothing. And nothing is honestly what we had with liver cancer for many years. But this trial took patients that were slightly younger than the average age. They certainly had better liver function. They didn't look like the average liver cancer patient that we see in clinic. And some of us who use this pill, we've noticed something odd. When I give my patients sorafenib in the real world, they have a lot of difficulty taking the pill. They often quit the pill. They often tell me it's intolerable. The side effects are horrible. They'd rather not take this pill than take anything at all. They'd rather not take anything than take this pill. So Stacy Doucet-Zena and Hannah Sanoff at the University of North Carolina, they noticed this, they found this observation interesting, and they looked at sorafenib and how it performs in Medicare, in patients over the age of 65, in real-world American patients. And they compared it against people who got no treatment, who looked like people who would otherwise have gotten sorafenib, but for whatever reason they did not get treatment. Here's what they found. First, of the patients with liver cancer who got treatment, the median survival is less than 6 months. In this study, the placebo group was more than 8 months. In the real world, the group getting the drug is less than 6 months. These groups are nothing alike. These patients are much slower growing tumors and they're much more healthy than real world patients who getting the drug. And when you compare real world patients who are getting the drug to patients who might have gotten the drug but didn't get the drug, there's absolutely no survival benefit in real world conditions. So what does this tell me? A marginal drug, a 2-month drug, we get in so many debates about, is a 2-month drug worth it? And again, I'll always say it's a step forward, but it's a baby step. But we miss the fact that a 2-month drug in an ideal population may be a 0-month drug in an average American with real other problems who have an advanced age, who may not be able to tolerate the medicine as well. For this reason, in JAMA Oncology, Sham Mailankody and I have proposed that actually overall survival, even this gold standard endpoint that we thought was really important, when you measure that in drug trials, in patients that don't look anything like average Americans, that may only be at best a surrogate endpoint for survival in the real world. And if the purpose of drug development in the United States and the purpose of drug regulation is to approve drugs that improve outcomes for Americans, which I believe that's the purpose. The FDA doesn't exist to help theoretical trial patients. They exist to help actual Americans who have cancer. That's the goal of the FDA. And if they're approving any drug with a marginal benefit, even if that marginal benefit is on survival, and if they're allowing drugs to be, it flicked out a second. If they're allowing drugs to be tested in populations that don't look like the United States population, then perhaps overall survival in clinical trials has become a surrogate endpoint, and we should treat it like other surrogate endpoints with an accelerated approval and a post-marketing commitment to test the drug in the real world with real Americans to see how it really works. Sorry, I'm just trying to advance the slide here. Can't seem to advance it. Oh, now we'll talk about R&D. For years, the widely circulated figure is that it costs $2.6 billion to bring a cancer drug to market. That figure came from the Tufts Medical Group. It used a confidential analysis of industry data. No one knows what companies they looked at, what drugs they looked at. The fact that it's confidential, I think actually, in my mind, runs against a basic principle of science, which is that it should be able to be understood and reproduced and engaged with by other scientists. So I'm very dismissive of this analysis. I don't like this analysis. I don't even know what they did, really. So to combat this, or I shouldn't say combat this, to really try to get a clean estimate that other people could look at, we decided to look at it in a I think, a very fair way. We took every cancer drug company that got a drug to market in the last, I think, 10 or so years, who were not selling any other drugs. They only got one drug to market. They had no other drugs on the market. That's Ariad Pharmaceuticals and Ponatinib, that's Pharmacyclics and Ibrutinib, that's Enzalutamide, that's Brentuximab and Seattle Genetics, etc. These are the companies that got a drug to market. They had no other drugs on the market. So this is a nice natural experiment. It allows us to kind of look at their SEC filings and try to figure out what did it cost them to bring the drug to market. So it turns out they got these 10 drugs to market. They were developing 44 other drugs in clinical trials, and they got 10 to market. And that's a failure rate of 77%, which is a similar failure rate to what the Tufts group says, has published previously in another paper, that there's a failure rate to getting drugs approved. So we have a similar failure rate. And what we found was that the total R&D cost to get a drug to market, it wasn't $2.6 billion. It was about $600 or $700 million on average. And that's the dark colored bar here. And we also looked at these drugs just in the first 4 years they were on the market, and they tend to be on the market for 14 years. So in the first 4 years, how much money did they make? And the answer was they made $60+ billion, and a median of about $1.7 billion per drug. So what's my takeaway? I would say that, and again here, the R&D cost we're adding here, this is the cost of all the 44 drugs pursued, just so 10 get to market. We're adding in the cost of all the failures. So what's the takeaway point here? Cancer drug development, it is costly. It's a few $100 million to develop a drug, but it's not probably a few $1 billion. That's probably a mistake. And there's lots of reasons why it's mistaken, which I won't bore you with, but it's a mistake, I think. But the reward of getting a cancer drug approved is very sizable. It is billions and billions of dollars. It's a good business to be in. It's a lucrative business to be in. The R&D doesn't justify the price. The price is far in excess of what the R&D outlay is. We can have a productive, vibrant drug sector, a private pharmaceutical industry with better regulations and better restraint on drug pricing, and everyone can be happy and patients can be better off, I think. Sorry, just trying to advance these slides. Okay. I guess the last thing I wanted to talk to you is an example of a drug which I think it's in breast cancer, and it sort of symbolizes everything that's wrong with drug development and with drug regulation and with drug pricing. It's like the metaphor for what's wrong with the system. That's neratinib. Neratinib is a HER2-directed small molecule inhibitor. It's unique in that the FDA approved this drug for adjuvant therapy given after Herceptin therapy for 1 year, before they approved the drug in the metastatic setting. This is unusual because every other drug ever approved in cancer showed benefit in the metastatic setting before it showed benefit in the adjuvant setting. It was approved in the metastatic setting first. And that's because it's easier to develop drugs for metastatic disease than drugs that are supposed to eradicate micrometastatic disease and improve cure rates as we need for drugs in the adjuvant setting. And I want to point out that neratinib was approved in the adjuvant setting. It's not like they didn't try for the metastatic setting. Here they shrug off a 479 patient phase 2 negative trial in the metastatic setting before they went for the adjuvant approval. This is the benefit of neratinib. This is, as they say proverbially, you can give the plenary session at the cancer national meeting if you have a hand steady enough to shine a laser pointer between the survival curves. And here I think neratinib lives up to that. These are the outcomes for invasive disease-free survival, which is a surrogate endpoint. It's not overall survival, it's invasive disease-free survival. And this is neratinib's benefit over placebo. It is a very, very, very small benefit, and it's very hard to fit the laser pointer between the two curves. I just want to contrast the neratinib data with other data in breast cancer. I think breast cancer, the incentives are so broken that we're doing such a disservice to patients. These are 3 trials in breast cancer. 2 of these trials actually support a drug being approved. One of these trials is a negative trial that actually tells you you don't need a full axillary nodal dissection. That's the negative trial. So tell me, which of these 3 curves is the negative study? Which is the study that says it's okay not to get an axillary node dissection? Is it this study? Nope, that's neratinib. Is it this study? These curves are almost on top of each other. Maybe this is the one that says it's okay to be in the control arm. Or is it this study? Well, it turns out it's this study. It's study C. This is pertuzumab. This is neratinib. My point here is that if you look at curves and you cannot tell which study is positive and which is negative, that's a problem. We need benefits big enough that with our eye, we can know which trials are positive. We are not doing things for things that look like they're bigger differences than things that we are doing stuff for. It's kind of a paradox here. We're willing to add a drug for this benefit, but we're willing to not do an axillary node dissection even if we could be losing that benefit. I think we've developed some sort of schizophrenia here. We're not being consistent. We're not doing trials that actually pursue differences that matter to patients. So when neratinib was approved, I was not happy about that. I thought that it was a bad drug. And I'll, where's my slide about? Oh, I missed my slide about the toxicity. So I think it's important to say that, okay, you may be thinking, look, there's a small benefit in a surrogate endpoint, and isn't that better than nothing? And I would say that that's true if the drug was tolerable, if you could take it and not have side effects. But unfortunately, the side effects of this drug are horrible. This is neratinib's grade 3 or 4 diarrhea. What is grade 3 diarrhea? Grade 3 diarrhea means that you have 7 stools more in a day than what you're having now. You have diarrhea so badly, it requires IV fluids or hospitalization, or it interferes with your activities of daily living. I think grade 3 diarrhea is catastrophically bad. I think it is a side effect that no one wants, particularly no one with a 90+% cure rate would want grade 3 diarrhea for a year. And yet neratinib has a 40% grade 3 diarrhea over 2% with placebo. Nausea is 40% versus 20%. Any grade vomiting, 23% versus 8%. This is an extremely toxic drug, debilitating drug that offers a small benefit on a surrogate endpoint. Okay, so for that reason, when you combine the toxicity of the drug, the sliver of benefit on a surrogate endpoint, not even survival, I think it is just a little too much to bear. So I tweeted, the US drug regulation allows companies to make billions of dollars from toxic marginal products. We're really buying our children BMW cars for every D+ on their report card. What incentive are we giving our children to get A+ drugs out there? We have no incentive because they can price the drug at whatever they want. They can make billions of dollars even if the drug is marginal. Why should they pursue better drugs? I think it would be irrational of them to pursue better drugs because those have higher failure rates. If you can get any marginal drug approved, that's what the incentives are for. And a key opinion leader in breast cancer replied to my tweet and said, look at the 5-year benefit. Do you prescribe AIs? We have the chance to help those with the worst outcomes. So this led to a debate. And I share this debate because I think it highlights some of the differences in thinking that are going on here. So I actually point out, this is a technical point, but 5 years was not the primary analysis data point, and actually this trial was not designed initially for 5-year data, and there's 25% missing data because they had to go after the fact to collect this data. When you have 25% missing data, that endpoint is a very unreliable endpoint. It's not the primary endpoint. So actually, there's a reason why I'm not showing you the 5-year benefit, because it's actually not as important. So I said 5 years is not the primary endpoint, it's missing data, and distant relapse and death is the most important endpoint, and that had a trivial difference at 2 years with very terrible side effects. I also pointed out you cannot look at trials and just cherry pick where the curves are the furthest apart. That's a principle of looking at trials. And then the key opinion leader replied back, indeed, but the hazard ratio was 0.66. Look how good the hazard ratio was. And the only reason the data was missing was the excellent updated analysis. And I guess what I would say is that, one, if the updated analysis was so excellent, there wouldn't be missing data, so this sentence makes no sense to me. And two, a hazard ratio is actually pretty meaningless to patients. And this person did not read this nice paper in Nature Reviews where they say a hazard ratio does not convey benefit in terms that are meaningful. It doesn't tell you how much longer you will live with or without experiencing disease progression. It is a unitless, arbitrary relationship between curves at every single time point. It doesn't actually inform patients whether or not they should do something. And then I tweet this slide, which I think is sort of the summary of all this, which is that, is it hopeless to think we can aspire for more in oncology, or are we condemned to this? And so let me explain this slide, because I think this is really, the crux of the issue. Even there are people out there who defend these marginal drugs, and I somewhat see what they're saying in the sense that, well, it's a step forward. But I think that if you give someone so much incentive to develop marginal drugs, you're not really encouraging them to develop very good drugs. That's actually not what you're doing. You're taking away the incentive to do a very good job, because why do a great job when you can make billions from a very marginal drug? And I guess I want to say this is a failure of the field. I mean, we're not doing justice for patients. We're not doing a good enough job for patients. Patients want better than this. And so Narad shows that. So let's take a look at the cost and benefits, the value here. Naratinib lowered distant recurrence or death about 1.3% in the trial, which means 24 patients have to take this for 1 year to prevent a distant recurrence or death. I said, let's assume this drug costs $10,000 a month, and assume you take it for 12 months. Then that means it's $9 million to prevent one distant recurrence or death. You don't improve overall survival, and 29 people get horrible diarrhea for free. $9 million to prevent an event is a number that there is no nation in the world rich enough that can continue to pay these kind of prices for drugs. It is an unsustainable number. This many people suffering to prevent the event is almost an untenable proposition, even if the drug were free. But it's certainly not tenable at $9 million an event. I think it will bankrupt every society. Schools will have to close. Roads will be unpaved. Society will fall apart when we pay for $9 million per event drugs. It is not how we can go forward. The benefits are too small. The price is too much. It's not fair. So that's why I say, is it hopeless to think we can aspire for more? Is this the best we can do? And I think people like Key Opinion Leader are saying this is the best we can do. And I said before I knew what this drug was priced, you could assume it's going to cost $10K a month. And then about a few weeks later, I found Puma expected to price the drug at $10K per month. And how did I know it was going to be priced at $10K per month? Because as I told you, the price of the drug is based on a little bit more than what the last drug was priced at. It's not based on rational factors. So final thoughts. The cost of drugs is skyrocketing. It's unsustainable. The profits from these drugs are so great. There is an incentive to get a drug to market, but because the FDA has continually lowered the bar to get to market, there is really no incentive to get a good drug to market. You just have to get any drug to market, and you can do that by squeaking by just getting over that limbo bar. Somebody used to say the bar was so low we could trip over it. I now sometimes think that they've lowered it enough that we just smoothly walk over it, not noticing it's on the floor. The cancer drug market defies market forces because the market is not a real market. It's been engineered through lobbying to serve entrenched interests. The market doesn't function as any normal market does. It merely allows people to make tremendous profits from very bad or marginal drugs. The value of these drugs is poor because the benefit is poor. If you want to improve the value of a medication, you can improve the value of every one of these drugs overnight by cutting the price in half. I saw somebody tweeted on Black Friday, there's a Black Friday sale for everything, but not for cancer drugs. And that the price is not coming down. And if drug companies are angry that that these ICER cost effectiveness is not good, they can lower the price and then it will be good because value is dictated by price and benefits. The benefits we see that are marginal, those are eroded in the real world. And in the real world with actual Americans, some of these benefits may even vanish altogether. This is the worst case scenario. You have a marginal drug that becomes an ineffective drug. I don't think there's anyone out there who thinks we should have more absolutely ineffective drugs in the market. The cost in oncology is tangible because the benefits are actually measured and not postulated. So, we can actually have these discussions. So I think that's my last slide, and I guess, happy to have a discussion about this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prasad. I feel like all of us in the office here, we're definitely raising our fists and clapping to so many things that you said, and I hope that folks who are listening in have also appreciated this presentation. So thank you again. Before we open it up to questions, which I will be reading out, as a reminder, if you have any questions, you can enter them into the chat box in the bottom right hand of your corner. But before we get to questions, I just want to talk really quickly about how you can get involved with Breast Cancer Action if you have been interested or motivated or excited by today's webinar. So first, you can become a member by signing up for our news and action alert emails, and that will keep you up to date on all of the issues and any upcoming webinars that we have. We do have a webinar scheduled already for next month on February 7th. You can also join us on Facebook or Twitter to connect with others and help us change the conversation online that's taking place about the breast cancer epidemic. Dr. Prasad showed you some of his conversations that he's had on Twitter. We also try to keep up and contribute where we can, although we are nowhere near as prolific as he is. And you can also help others get involved by telling your friends, coworkers, and family about this webinar and about the work we do and how they can take action. And lastly, you can donate to support our education and advocacy work. So keeping in mind that we don't have that much time left, I will open it up for questions now. And I'm seeing that there are a few just logistics about can we get copies of the slides, so I can answer that first. Yes, if you have registered, a recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone. So not only will you get the slides, you will have Dr. Prasad's presentation as well. So this question is coming from Sani. I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. For Dr. Prasad regarding profits. Given the lack of transparency with drug company expenditures, profit stats are often disputed. How are you confident in the data shared? What are your sources, given that global data can be vague?
Hi, I guess I'd say a few things. So one of the data points was, publicly reported newspaper story, and I think I just cropped the figure. And we did a full investigation that's in JAMA Internal Medicine, peer-reviewed paper on the cost and revenues after approval, where we actually audited all the SEC filings, which I assume there are some legal rules about what has to go into that to make sure that it is faithful and accurate, and that's where we get those numbers from that R&D figure paper. I guess what I would say is that if somebody were to tell me that it's even more lucrative, I guess I wouldn't be surprised. But if you were telling me that it's actually a struggle to make money in this field, I guess I would say that I would highly doubt that, because I think it is a good business to be in. And I think there's another thing to point out, that I guess when I was talking about risk, I want to make the point that there are small biotech companies where it is risky because the whole company could go full belly up because they're just pure hype and they have no effective drug, and pretty soon people will see the emperor has no clothes. But the large pharmaceutical companies have a broad portfolio of drugs, and you can't judge them on the risk of any one drug. They are playing a portfolio bet, and they're profiting from that bet quarter after quarter. So I believe that if you continue to profit quarter after quarter, it can't be that risky a game you're playing. You're playing a good game. You have a diversified portfolio of drugs.
Thank you. That was a great response and a good question. So this one comes from one of our members, Jean R., and she asks, has the Orphan Drug Act of the 1980s helped bring down costs of meds for rare cancers?
So that's a good question. I'm not an expert on that particular question. The person who is Aaron Kesselheim, who's written about this extensively. And my understanding of reading his articles is that the Orphan Drug Act, which orphan drug is actually defined in a way that a lot of us in medicine don't think is really orphan, which is any disease that affects less than 100,000 people, which is a lot of cancers that we actually kind of consider quite common. And it has led to a lot of incentives, a lot of tax credits, but really developing drugs for the rarest of diseases, I think a lot of people wonder if it's done much good for doing that. People certainly play the orphan drug game. They benefit from it financially, but I think a lot of people have criticized its ability to bring drugs to market for conditions that are truly rare and truly difficult to have drug development in.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the direction we can go to for that information. So Eric B. asks, since costs are unsustainable, how do you think this situation will evolve? What will break or what will change?
Well, I guess that's a great question. And I guess I hate to, I would say that there will be some fix in place. And I think the worry is that if you let the system get so broken, if you only fix it in a moment of crisis, the fix may be a half measure, may only fix part of things and may make some problems worse. I think you need lawmakers to actually take a close look at this problem. There's a number of fixes that I think are reasonable first steps, allowing Medicare the ability to negotiate the price of drugs. For some drugs developed almost solely with federal expenditures, ways in which the federal government can ensure they're priced affordably, not just snatched up by the latest pharmaceutical company and priced exorbitantly. I think we have to admit that we don't have a free market. We have a market that is rigged in favor of the people who sell the products, and it's happened that way through years of careful lobbying. So we're not talking about solutions to really, twist anyone's arm. We're just talking about solutions to actually try to make the market a little bit more fair and make these drug pricing a little bit more sensible. And my thought is that there is a strong public, I think, consensus around this issue. There will be a day when people decide what they actually want to do some legislating, that this will be a top priority, and it's something that could be solved in a way that a lot of people agree, in a very broadly bipartisan way. It probably could be solved. Those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you. And I love that we're ending on a slightly more uplifting note, or at least an action-oriented note. So this final question is from Mary P., and it's sort of in the same vein of what next, what now? And Dr. Prasad, I hear you saying that legislation is going to play a really important role. Mary's question is, what could insurance companies do to put pressure on drug companies to modify costs, and what, if any, role does insurance need to play?
So I guess let me just say about the insurance company. I guess I would say that, although we think the insurance company has a strong incentive to cut costs in the system, I think there's some things about the system that have actually taken away that incentive. For instance, the Affordable Care Act, one of the provisions caps the amount of money an insurer can claim as profit as 20%. And so I always tell this analogy. If I told you and you're really hungry, I'm going to order a pizza, but you can only eat 20% of the pizza. And I ask you, what size should I order, medium, large, or extra large? You're going to say extra large because you can only eat 20%, and that's the way you get the most pizza. And that is really kind of the situation with insurers. They have a perverse incentive in many cases to let the healthcare pie get bigger because then they get a bigger chunk of the pie. So I really haven't seen that much initiative from insurers to really push back hard on the cost of these things. And I'm not sure it's really in their incentive in the current structure. I guess I will talk a little bit about what, people listening here, who I assume are mostly patient advocates and people who work in this space can do. I think we have a narrative, especially around the patient communities, that the only thing patients want are more drugs. I think the conflict of interest in patient advocacy groups is incredibly corrosive, and we've seen over and over patient advocacy groups heavily taking money from the industry, lobbying for drug approval, and then once the drug comes and is priced unaffordably, they're very quiet about that topic. I think that is an unsustainable strategy. We need advocates who advocate for better drugs, wise approvals, not just any approvals. Patients don't want options; they want good options, and patients want good options that are affordable. And we have to be very careful that what we're approving is a good option, not just an option, and that it's affordable. And we have to push hard on that issue. And then I think all of us, myself included, there's all more we can be learning about the intricacies of drug approval, and we should educate ourselves so that we can be, advocates for better policies in the future. So I guess those are the final thoughts. So I just want to thank everyone for attending, and thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Prasad. This was a wonderful webinar, and we really appreciate having you. So just one more big thank you from all of us to Dr. Prasad for his presentation today. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.